year for addressing global warming. And as UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently said, this is going to be the year to reconcile humanity with nature. Of course, in the UK, we have the COP26 that's going to be hosted by the UK in Glasgow. And also the UK and EU is going to be among those nations pushing mostly for an ambitious round for a new round of decarbonisation commitments. And as we know, action is really needed at global level, but also all nations and regions and communities need to have the right tools and to show leadership if we're to truly treat this as a climate emergency. I'm really, really pleased to present to you today the panel of speakers, because it really is extraordinary. So here we have Ed Miliband, MP, former leader of the Labour Party, of course, and now Shadow Secretary of State for BASE, the Ministry for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. We also have Saeed El-Khadraoui, Special Advisor at FEPS on the EU Green Deal, and Tom Hayes, City Councillor in Oxford, Deputy Leader, Cabinet Member of Green Transport and Zero Carbon Oxford. We also have Katie White, OBE, Executive Director of Advocacy and Campaigns at WWF. And we have Farhana Yamin, who is Associate Fellow on Energy, Environment and the Resource Programme at Chatham House. I'm just going to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us, to all the speakers. We're really, really pleased that we can have this discussion today. I was going to take a photo of us all, but we'll wait for Katie to come back and we'll take one later. Just to go through a couple of things about the format of the event, we have an hour and 15 minutes. Each of the speakers, you have about 7 minutes. So that means that we should have about 30 minutes for Q&A. When the Q&A starts, just so you know, it's not the chat, it's this little button that you have on the left of your screens, which is the question mark icon. So that's where, if you have your questions, please put them there and we'll be following them later. Just a note for the speakers, this session is on record, and we do have some journalists with us today. As I say, people will be tweeting, as you know, and everyone's encouraged to do so. As you know, the hashtag, in case you've just joined, is hashtag FEPSFab21, and also the videos of the sessions are going to be put online afterwards. So that's it from me. So I'm going to introduce the first speaker, please, Ed Miliband. It's a pleasure to see you and for you to join us today. Please, Ed, tell us, what do you think should be the list priorities for tackling climate change in 2021, and what should be our aims for the COP26 summit to ensure it is a success?
Well, look, Charlotte, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to have this invitation, and I want to apologise in advance if my video connection is slightly dodgy. So do let me know if you can't hear me. I think I know my other colleagues will talk a lot about COP26, and I will just say something very briefly about that, and then I want to really talk about what the UK can do domestically and what argument we in Britain need to be advancing. I suppose my starting point is this, and it is rather obvious, but I think it is worth saying, which is climate is the defining issue of our time, and we are living through the defining 10-year period on this issue. And I think it is so important to say this, because it really shows why it must be at the centre of Labour's agenda and the centre of our country's agenda. The UN has told us this is the crucial 10 years which will define the situation for generations to come. We will either succeed in meeting the high-level ambitions we set out at Paris to keep global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees, or we will fail to do that, and that will be defined by what we do in the next decade. And it's very unfortunate from our point of view that the Conservative government is going to be in power for up to 2024 when this is such a crucial period. If there's one thing that COVID teaches us, it's that we must follow the science, and I think that is clear in relation to climate. We know this is an issue that is not going to affect everybody equally if we fail to act. It's a massive social justice issue. I see that in my own constituency in Doncaster. I saw that when we flooded in 2019. We see that globally too. And the other thing I'd say, the other reason why this issue is so important is it is representative of the deeper problems of the way our country is run. Whether it is about an extractive economy, which we see in relation to the fossil fuel economy run on the basis of shareholder value, or a society where we prioritize GDP above so many other things in life that really matter, from time to care to a whole range of other things, or a society where we don't properly think about intergenerational justice. So for all those reasons, I think it must be central. And in relation to COP26, we must be the persuaders for maximum ambition. And that is the job of the UK and the EU, which is to push as hard and as far as we can for countries to raise their ambitions, not for 2050 only, or for the long term, but for 2030, which, as I say, is the crucial defining moment. Now, what does that mean for us in the UK about our own domestic agenda? We have a job, I think, of principle and persuasion here. Principle, because we must meet the urgency of the challenge, which I've briefly set out in relation to climate, and persuasion, because we need to win over the British people to this agenda. I say win over. I actually think what's very interesting about this is that there is broad support for this agenda. If you look at the recent More in Common report that was done, this shows that this is not just an issue for a minority. Right across the population, this is something people care deeply about, but we must address this issue in a way that is going to take people with us. And I don't think there is actually a contradiction between the need to maximum ambition here and principle and persuading people to come with us for reasons that I will now explain. And I think the heart of this is about putting economic and social justice at the heart of the climate agenda. Climate is, of course, an environmental issue, but it is about so much more than that. It is about whether we confront the massive inequalities and injustices in our country. As we confront the climate emergency, are we going to take on those injustices, or are we going to either let them carry on as they are, or indeed potentially make them allow them to get worse? And I say we've got to both confront the climate challenge, but in doing that, confront the deep inequalities and injustices that we face. I want to explain what I mean by that. The shorthand for this agenda has become the Green New Deal. Now, the Green New Deal for us, starts with a green recovery. And that's why we set out a plan for a 30 billion stimulus to create 400,000 jobs in our country across a whole range of areas over the next 18 months. I'm afraid the government hasn't stepped up to the scale of the challenge need to do on this issue. And that green recovery agenda is incredibly important in my view. But I think the point I want to make is that is only one part of the agenda of the Green New Deal. You know, people think that the whole Green New Deal idea harks back to Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt was, of course, about stimulating demand and addressing the economic emergency that America faced in the 1930s. But he was also about reorienting the balance of power in the United States and confronting the deep inequalities and injustices in the country. And to an extent, over the time of his presidency, he did that. And we need to do the same thing here. Now, what do I mean by that? In relation to the household sector, for example, we know we need a massive transformation of our homes over the next decade or more. And that can create hundreds of thousands of jobs of what I call a zero carbon arm of people. But at the same time, we've got to address the problems of fuel poverty and unfairness that so many people face in relation to housing. And we've got to do both things, create the jobs that can make a difference, but also confront the deep deep inequalities and injustices in relation to housing, the housing market, and what people face. Take transport. Again, there's massive job opportunities here. And the transition to electric cars is absolutely right, taking fossil fuel, taking petrol and diesel cars off the road by 2030. But this agenda has also got to be about how we sort out our public transport system, our rail and bus services, how we reorient our towns and cities so they lend themselves to walking and cycling, how we improve people's quality of life. Take the issue of land. Of course, it's about rewilding, tree planting, and all of those things that can make a difference and create jobs. But it is also about the issue of access to green spaces that people have in our country. How fair or unfair is that? We've seen the importance during this period of people having access to parks and other green spaces. You know, how are we going to confront that and change that in a way that is fair? Or take the power sector, for example. It's about a transition to renewable energy, and that's incredibly important, and zero carbon energy. But are we going to create the jobs in this country? Just to give you one fact, for every megawatt of new offshore wind capacity creates one job in the UK, it creates 5 jobs in Denmark. Now, why is that? It's because Denmark has a proper industrial strategy to take advantage of the opportunities that offshore wind provides. And it is also about a power system that is properly accountable to the public and confronts the failure of the free market experiment in relation to power. So my argument is this, which is we've got to confront the climate emergency. We can do so in a way that creates a country, but we also have to confront the unfairness and inequalities that we know. And that isn't just an agenda for the left. That is the only way we take people with us. Because the other thing that More in Common report that I referred to showed is that what is the thing that might stop us taking the public with us on this journey in relation to the scale of change we need in relation to climate, is if they think that the transition is not fair. And unless the transition is fair, we won't take people with us, and that is absolutely central to what we need to do. Let me just say a couple of things before I finish. People will have seen that Boris Johnson is talking about this agenda. I think it's good that he's talking about this agenda. I just don't think he can possibly, and the Tory philosophy can possibly address this issue in the way that is required. We see a constant failure to match the rhetoric of the government with delivery. And if you think about the issues of unfairness that I've talked about, you can't build a fair, just, green economy on the back of an attack on workers' rights, which we know that the government is trying to do from the last couple of days. You can't build a fair, just, green economy without a proper industrial strategy that properly invests in the future, which we know the government is already failing to do, and I fear will continue to fail to do. And we know you can't build the just, fair, green economy without addressing the underlying issues of poverty and injustice that we face in our country. The point I would end on is this: I think there is a massive agenda for us here as a party, and a party that we must, and an agenda that we must address. Keir has rightly said that if we want to return to normal as quickly as possible, but there can be no return to business as usual. In this area, it is more true probably than in any other area. But the last thing I'd say is that this agenda is too urgent for us to wait till 2024 to confront. And this is about the work of local government in addressing the climate emergency. And it is also about the work we need to do as a party and a movement at the forefront of the COP26 mobilization. And there we need to see, in my view, the biggest mobilization, notwithstanding the COVID situation. And however it is done, we need to see the biggest mobilization we have ever seen in relation to climate. Because this is a moment when the world must come together in Glasgow in November and show that it can step up to the scale of the emergency that we face and the scale of ambition we need. And Britain must play its part, and the Labour Party must play its part in making that happen.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I really hope that we can step up, as you say, this November in Glasgow. And thank you also for setting out Labour's priorities in this field and absolutely putting economic and social matters at the heart of the environmental agenda. Just while we're still fresh, I'm just going to ask the speakers to pose a minute and try and smile, and I'm just going to try and take a little screenshot of us so that we're all looking at the camera and we haven't got our heads down. Just bear with me. So 1, 2, and 3. Great, thank you very much. Sorry about that. And so now moving on, thank you very much, Ed, for your words, and we'll move on now to Saeed, who, as I said, is Special Advisor at FLEX on the Green Deal, and also former MEP who the group from Belgium. Saeed, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thanks for the invitation. Very happy to be with you today. Let me first emphasize that, in my opinion, this year, 2021, will really be a crucial year. First, of course, because with the reintegration of the United States in the Paris Agreement, recent announcements by Japan, South Korea to become climate neutral by 2050, China by 2060, the momentum is growing for a shared vision and a global agenda on climate action. And I think the COP26 in Glasgow can be a unique opportunity to celebrate this, take stock, but also, and I agree with Ed on this, to reflect on how we can accelerate in the next few years. That would be crucial. Secondly, seen from a European perspective, this will be the year that makes or breaks the famous European Green Deal. As you may remember, the European Green Deal was launched by the Commission back in 2019 as a vision for the way forward, and with the central objective to transform the EU's economy into a climate neutral one by 2050. And obviously, it's not the first time that the EU developed policies around climate and the environment, but I think it's fair to say that it is the first time that climate action has been positioned at the heart of the policy agenda. And what's more, increasingly, there is an acknowledgement that it is about much more than reducing emissions. The climate crisis is a systemic challenge. We will not find a single vaccine to address global warming. Instead, to be successful, we'll have to fundamentally transform the key systems of our economy and society, our energy system, the mobility, food systems, the way we produce and consume goods, the way we build our cities. And that's why it was good to see that in the course of 2020, a wide range of sub-strategies with action plans have been launched in the EU to trigger public debates and prepare the ground for future action around issues such as biodiversity, food, smart and sustainable mobility, circular economy, and so on. 2020 was also the year that the EU reassessed its 2030 objectives by committing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55%, up from 40% compared to 1990. And I think this is important because it helps citizens and economic actors to understand the direction of travel and also the acceleration needed. 2020 was also the year that brought clarity about the financial means made available by the EU to address climate action. You may have heard about the deal around the 1,000 billion euros budget that can be spent between now and 27. 30% of this will have to be earmarked to climate action. In the previous panel, Laszlo Andor mentioned already the recovery plans that have been launched. Also here, 37% will have to go towards climate action. There is also the European Investment Bank, the EU's bank that committed itself to change its lending policies and to focus at least 50% of its loans towards climate projects and activities. And I think finally, 2020 was also important because we discussed the famous European climate law that provides the architecture for the mechanics that should keep us on track on our journey towards climate neutrality, with a 5-yearly update that offers an opportunity to see where we are, readjust policies where needed in the future. But 2021 will be the year that strategies and the new 2030 targets will have to be translated into action, new legislation, accompanying measures. Before the summer, we'll hear more about how we'll have to redesign the emission trading system, possibly enlarging the scope to new sectors. It's also about redistributing the efforts between member states. That will be a heavy fight between states. Rethinking the energy legislation, emission targets for cars, and so many of the concrete actions that have been announced in 2020. They will have to come to life. So, as we all know, the devil is in the detail, and that's why I think this year will be crucial. And the avalanche of initiatives will also coincide with the phasing out of massive state support to address the COVID crisis. And it remains to be seen how the expected backlash in terms of unemployment and maybe also bankruptcies that will follow, how this will impact the appetite of governments to support the necessary high ambition measures. And that is why the design of these recovery plans and the speed at which they will be implemented, the effectiveness of all of this will be crucial. Because not all investments in climate action lead automatically to good outcomes. It's about choices. It's about choosing the right type of investments. And investment decisions today, especially in infrastructure, have an impact for the next 30 or 40 years. So all these things are interlinked, and the different pieces of the puzzle will have to be carefully calibrated with the level of ambition that we have agreed. And this brings me to the crucial point. I believe progressives need to integrate even more explicitly, and Ed referred to it clearly, is the human dimension. As with all transitions, there will be winners and losers. So yes, we need to be creative, invent the solutions, products and services that lead us to net zero future. This is about innovation, this is about industrial policies and so on. But many people may have the feeling that there will be no place for them in future. And it's clear that people will oppose change if it creates and aggravates inequalities. And it will therefore be crucial to embed the social consideration more structurally in everything we do, to carefully monitor the distributional effects of some measures, make sure that the transition benefits ordinary people, showcase real solutions that can change people's lives. For instance, housing is a good example. Accelerate visible and targeted investments in the massive renovation, upgrading of social housing and more broadly housing of ordinary people. We can achieve triple win situations, address energy poverty, scale up markets for innovative solutions, create local jobs. Similarly, lifelong learning, reskilling, upskilling, people will have to be at the core of climate action. And the other important thing is that we need to define the climate transition much more as a societal project, where top-down government interventions are combined with bottom-up actions by diverse actors. This endeavor will only succeed if people, cities, local communities, businesses, new types of organizations, civil society, and so on are part of the game, stimulated in co-creating solutions for a better future. So yes, we need leadership, but this is not only about political leadership. That is crucial, but it's leadership across the board, multi-level, multi-stakeholder. And we need to be much more creative and find new ways of working together, new governance models. Finally, one last word on the UK-EU cooperation. I think it's obvious that despite Brexit, we need to continue cooperating around the broader climate agenda. I think especially around science and technology, including through the Horizon Europe program, around energy cooperation, about standards for products and services, but also about sustainable finance, how to transform the financial system and make it more long-term and to the benefit of our society. These are the type of issues I think you are good at. We also, and we need to work together. So I leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Saeed. Yeah, absolutely. 2021, like you say, is the make or break year. And you highlighted, you emphasized why that is. So thank you very much. I just put in a link to a latest report that we did on, as Saeed was mentioning, these bottom-up approaches of really involving people, because, as you say, it's also about a social project as well. So now we're going to move on to Tom Hayes, please. So as you are council at local level, or city level, I should say. So as we've been talking about the different levels of governance, how do you think leaders should work together to ramp up ambition at different levels, and especially to deliver for the net zero carbon emissions? Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte. It won't surprise you to hear that I'm going to make a pitch for municipal socialism, and why I think pulling a lever at the local level, the Labour local level, is the right approach. But I just want to start by picking up on the point that Ed was making about this being an international and an intergenerational issue to meet the climate emergency. The current Prime Minister is 56 years of age. An 18-year-old who will cast their first ballot in the all-important local elections this year will only reach the Prime Minister's age in 2059. What kind of a world will they live in? What kind of a country will we be in? And I think we really need to give a lot of thought to what that would look like. But we can't wait to arrive at that world. We have to take action right now. And it's not just to meet the climate emergency. It's because, and I don't know about how it feels for all of you, whenever I say Happy New Year, people just look at me and go, we're this many days in, why would we be happy? It just feels like an extension of 2020 with all the things that have been packed into January. And I think that speaks to the fact that the country feels spiritually broken. I think that meeting the climate emergency can help to create a better country. We need to have a country which is at ease with itself and the world, where we have a culture and a sense of belonging to the people and places that matter to us, a sense of confidence about who we are and what we will be after leaving the European Union, and frankly, just hopefulness. We need to address the climate emergency in a hopeful way. And I think the language that we use is really important. When we call it a climate emergency, it obviously denotes the urgency with which we have to address a really significant global problem. But we need to change our language. We need to think about building a zero carbon Britain. We need to think about achieving something positive. And I think that's where the COP is really important, because it's a chance for us as a country to step forward. So leadership, as we know, is going to be key. It's the first major international summit hosted by the UK since leaving the European Union. It's the first major climate summit since Paris. We're expecting the major countries to come with their 1.5 degrees Celsius NDC compliant plans. We're going to have it's the first summit since the country has set a target in law to achieve a bold environmental agenda, although they don't have a plan to achieve it. And it's the first summit since the government hacked away at DFID and our ambitions to support the world's poorest. And so as a country, we really need to put our best foot forward, and we're not prepared. We've been thinking about too many things for too long, particularly Brexit. And as a consequence, the civil service is not in the place it needs to be in. The French were far ahead at this stage in planning for Paris. And I think that means that we all need to galvanise together to put pressure on government to take this seriously. The UK has set that ambition into law, but as I say, they don't have anywhere near the plan that they need in order to achieve that. At the moment, it's all just words. And all the major blockers of action at the COP25, who will come to the same conclusion at the COP26 that they should block action, with maybe the exception of the US this time, will look at the UK and they'll think it's warm words, but there's no action. There really needs to be something going on. We're already 20% off our current targets, and we have been for about 5 years. So how do we get back on track to meet our own climate ambitions? How do we bolster leadership? And I think it's worth here wondering about how we do this at the COP in a fair way. We postponed the previous COP because of the pandemic, but also because we were concerned that all of the participants that we need to contribute to the COP weren't going to be in the best place to do that. Now, when we move to the COP, are we sure that the representatives of the poorer countries, the low-income countries, are going to have the same extent of vaccination as those in richer countries? Can we guarantee that there's going to be an equity in vaccination around the world to ensure that we've got full and fair participation at the COP? And I think this is where I arrive at the question: what would a Labour presidency of the COP achieve differently to the Alex Sharma presidency of the COP? I spent a lot of time in 2015 trying to defeat Alex Sharma in Reading West. Didn't quite work out. But what would we do differently now? And I think it arrives us at 2 to 3 major points. The first is that we need to rethink what our vision for the country will be, what our economy will be after leaving the European Union. What are our strengths? How do we build on those? How do we achieve the level of economic growth sustainably, but in harmony with the needs of our population? Secondly, it's about welfare. Labour was at its best in government when it was creating the bedrock for people to feel protected. The 1945 settlement, the years of the Labour government from 1997 to 2010. What's our new vision for welfare, and how do we give our public the sense that they will feel protected from not just the climate impacts which are on their way, but the economic disruptions which are going to follow as the market adapts to the need to address our climate emergency? And it's not just about the left saying that saying to our public, we're thinking about your next job. We're thinking about the jobs for the future. We're thinking about lifelong training. It's about saying to the public right now, where they are in their current jobs, that we recognise there's going to be some kind of a transition. Here's the kind of support that we're going to give to make that happen. I think too often when I go home to Salford in Greater Manchester and I talk to people about the climate breakdown we face and the economy we should be in, they feel a little bit like Labour's too concerned on pulling levers for a mass transformation of our economy and to try and get them out of their current jobs and to create even more insecurity in the world that they live in. I think we need to have a better way of communicating. And I think it's lastly also about citizenship. We can't achieve more climate contributions and carbon reductions through the back door. We can't achieve it by stealth. We need to be creating not just a new constitutional settlement, which brings together all the nations and all the local authority areas into a harmony, and so we've got no continued political uncertainty. It's also about reinventing what it is to be an active citizen of the UK. And in Oxford, and I'm going to talk here a bit about municipal socialism and why local government is the best level of government. We try to meet people where they are by holding the UK, the first Citizens' Assembly on climate change by a UK city. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating insights. We did this because we know in Oxford that we've got a very engaged and passionate population on behalf of green issues, but sometimes that population crowds out the views of the lower income and poorer communities in our city. And many people, when they think of Oxford, will think of it as the city of dreamy spires, a very well-off city. We have enormous pockets of poverty. We have a very big inequality gap in our city, which has been aggravated by this government over the last 10 years and its treatment of our city and other cities through the pandemic. And so the Citizens' Assembly brought to light real insights. It showed that 90% of our Assembly members wanted the city to go further and faster than the government's 2050 target. But a third were consistently concerned that actually the 2050 target was an already ambitious one and that there weren't pathways in place to achieve it. Where you might have thought that through education and introduction of people to climate issues, we could galvanise everybody to meet the climate emergency and do more, we actually had some of the more informed members of our citizenry come into the Citizens' Assembly, hear about in even greater detail the scale of the challenge, and they go, whoa, this is too much. We need to retreat here. We've got too much going on as a country. We don't need to throw ourselves forward as quickly as we thought. And then the reverse of that, where we had people we knew were more sceptical about climate issues and less ambitious to move forward faster, completely convinced. And I'll always remember the single mum on the Rose Hill estate in Oxford, a poorer part of the city, who came up to me and to another person from a richer part of the city and said, why do you get to have a zero carbon community group? Why do all of you get to have the time and the money to come together and discuss these issues? I want that for my community. I want the council to support me to set that up. And that's been one of the ambitions the council's carried forward. And we've held things like youth climate summits and other engagement fora to make sure that we're truly listening to people about what our zero carbon agenda should be. And then when we look at the different ways in which there are emissions problems in our city, whether it be buildings or transport or energy, we've taken a distinctly local approach. On buildings, we recognise that the government say that we need to have all buildings retrofitted to EPCC by 2035. The government are miles away from achieving that. And it's falling to councils to have to look into their HRA budget and other budgets to find the funding to introduce those energy efficiency measures. And my council has dedicated 50 million to doing this in our next budget. On transport, the City of Oxford will be home to either the world's first zero emission zone, if you don't count some breeze blocks in Madrid streets, or the UK's first zero emission zone. which will restrict polluting vehicles coming into the city centre from later this year, extending across the whole of the city centre from 2022, and then rushing forward to the whole city by 2030 at the latest. We're also introducing something called Connecting Oxford, which aims to address congestion, but also in so doing reduce the need for car trips through the introduction of bus gates and a workplace parking levy, and by the investment in public services, particularly bus routes, because we all want a fully functioning bus network. And then on top of that, we're introducing significant levels of EV charging infrastructure, including lots of trials and of new technologies, such as the world's first pop-up on-street charging. But this is where government can play a role. Government have come forward and they've sped up the ban on petrol and diesel vehicles, but they are nowhere in supporting local authorities to have mass installation of EV charging. We've got too many types of charger run by too many different companies or manufacturers with too many payment systems and too many different types of connectors. It's mind-bogglingly difficult for people to understand. Local authorities often own the land that the EV chargers need to go on. If local authorities had the funding to set up publicly owned EV charging, that could be both an income generator for cash-strapped local government, but it can also help to address the need to mass introduce EV chargers. And then looking out to biodiversity and energy, in Oxford, we're trying to enhance our biodiversity, not just with more of the right trees in the right places, but by doing it in harmony with nature, recognising that we face an ecological crisis. And then lastly, on energy. In Oxford, we have invested in renewable energy, which is community owned. So as a city,
last point, please, Tom.
Yeah. So as a city council, we've invested £6 million in loans to something called Low Carbon Hub, which has helped to grow solar and wind energy generation within Oxford, which means that we send less money out to the big six. We keep more money locally owned. As a consequence, we've got active energy citizens. And I'll just close by saying that we know we face a climate crisis. We know we need to do more. And I'm always reminded of the words of Maya Angelou, who says, do the best that you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. We know better, we need to do better, but as a country, we're not there yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for your very detailed intervention there. We're going to move on now to Katie. So I think your microphone was working, wasn't it?
Does that sound? Can you hear me?
That sounds perfect.
Small wins in the technical age are very joyous.
After about a year of doing this, we're all starting to get used to it. But so, Katie, please tell us what do we need to be doing more of, basically. I think would be good to hear from you, and please bring in your intervention. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlotte, and thanks so much. A great a setup and some speaking points, and I was nodding and going along with a lot of those. So I'll just make 3 points because I know with time is tight, and I'd really like to hear the questions as well. I mean, in terms of, I totally agree with Tom in terms of the language. And I think we need to be really careful. And you know, Ed has been working in this, as has I, for quite a long time. And in a way, you almost get numb to some of that language. And you know, crisis, emergency, we hear it. And as I say, society is quite fatigued. So I guess we've got to be really careful about how we position this. And I keep being like, you know, and in my head, to be honest, there's what are the forces of positivity and what are the reasons for concern. And I say this very consciously, but I do feel we are at a crossroads. On the one hand, the science is awful. It's absolutely awful, you know, in terms of it gets worse and worse. And to be honest, I can hardly bring myself at times to really comprehend that science because it's getting worse. And my background is very much in climate change, but I joined WWF about 18 months ago because of the great work they've been doing. And clearly WWF does a lot of work on climate change and on biodiversity. And last year we brought out this Living Planet report that we do across the whole world every 2 years, looking at the state of nature across the whole world. And we found that since 1970, and I better say that quite a lot of people might have been born in and around 1970, but it's not a huge, you know, a really long time ago. And we look at the history of humanity. Since 1970, we've lost 68% of nature. Like, I just find that absolutely mind-boggling that, like, within our lifetimes, or you know, a certain, I'd be younger and older people on the call, but in terms of 2/3 of nature, now obviously that's more in some and less in others, but we're talking about plants, species, animals. That is, you know, it's unbelievable, and that is not something we want to leave to our children and our grandchildren. It's a disgrace. And in terms of, you know, we look at the climate science on the news coming back, this is now the, you know, hottest decade. And we keep hearing this again and again and again. But just to set that backdrop, it is pretty terrifying. Okay, so I'm putting across the really miserable, harsh stuff to one side. The reasons to be cheerful. Sorry, Ed, to nick your line, but the reasons to be cheerful. Okay, it is moving so fast, the agenda, you know, in terms of, we've been working on this for years, and in 2008 we're going 60% reductions in emissions, please. Then we go 80% reductions. Now we're at 100% reductions. And more to that, the market forces are actually now working in our favor. In developing countries, solar is cheaper than coal. I mean, that's amazing. You know, that actually it is cheaper for our solar than coal. You know, and in terms of the amount of companies that are falling over themselves to, you know, come forward with net zero commitments, you know, and the pack. And I've had to speak to companies, I shouldn't say who, this week, to say, I'm really sorry, that commitment's just not good enough. Maybe 6 months ago it was, but the pack's moved. And I need to tell you what's going on in terms of the science. So in terms of the commitments, the markets, the interventions, the level of ambition is going up. So I think that is really, really good news and something to be cheerful about. My second point is about leadership and the race to the top. We're here today to talk about the UK and about Europe and how they can work together. And I think we've got to create a race to the top. And the UK has got to lead where it can lead, and Europe's got to lead where it can lead. And so there are areas where the UK is going to do more than Europe. And and this government will do more than Europe. And one of them is on agricultural reform. You know, in terms of the European Union has just signed up for another 7 years of CAP. We know that CAP in terms of is an outdated subsidy that is not doing a good thing in terms of, you know, supporting our systems. Our land systems are crucial, and our food systems in terms of climate and biodiversity. And I'm afraid they've not taken a leadership role on that. And the UK government will hopefully do that. They've set out, you know, the parameters to support our farmers to be frontline climate heroes. But again, and I think it was Syed said, the devil is in the detail. The devil is always in the detail. And in terms of, we've got these, you know, we've got some good frameworks in the UK, but we need to make sure that actually the detail adds up to that. And one of the things we're really calling for in the UK is a net zero test. And we've been thrilled that Annalise Dodds has also been calling for this, because I think it's a case of, we've set out this framework, but the investment in government is not adding up to that. And we don't want a net zero test at the end of the green recovery. We want a net zero test now, so we can look and make sure that across the board, we have got investment that delivers on that net zero commitment. It's kind of mad that we haven't already done this, and it's not adding up. So we're hoping that the government will come forward with a net zero test of investment, and we'd love across Europe, you know, a net zero test to look at how all of our investment is delivering on those commitments. And on that leadership piece, I think, you know, we talked a case about that. Leadership's got to come from everywhere. There is no monopoly on good ideas in this. And I also think that nobody has got the answer entirely. And I say that as an NGO who's got some of the answers, as an opposition who's got some of the answers, as a government who's got some of the answers, as civil society who's got some of the answers. And we've all got to be able to work together on this. This is going to be a new experiment of society working in a different way. We've got to learn to work together. We've got to learn to look at ourselves and realize where actually we've got it wrong. And we've got to look out and be creative. And that co-creation has got to come everywhere. My final point is around COP. COP matters. It does matter. And I saw a comment or a question in the chat coming up saying, we've heard this before. And I know, I look at Fahana and I look at, we have heard this before. We definitely have. But it doesn't mean to say that this doesn't matter. That science, as I started off, is getting worse. And we know that we need a global response to this global problem. We've seen it with COVID. And in a way, COVID has changed the dynamics for a couple of reasons. One, because it's been a better explainer of interconnectedness and global problems and global solutions than any of us have ever been able to do before. It's really got us in touch with the fact that our systems are linked together. If we destroy nature, you know, there is going to be impacts of that, and we need to make sure that there is a sort of solutions response. And secondly, as I think it was Tom saying, actually the dynamics are better than they were for a COP at the end of last year. You know, for reasons outside of the government's control, mainly because of Joe Biden. You know, we're sitting and we've got WWF offices in 100 countries, and we're seeing the impact all over the world of the Biden administration coming in, which is fantastic. We're seeing it on the US Fed. You know, they're looking at their regulatory changes because we can feel that gust of positive wind coming in, and we need to make the most of that. And we know that the Biden administration will have more connections with the Labour opposition. So I urge them to use those connections, and let's try and make sure there is an effort, because we do want to make this COP. It won't be the answer to everything, of course not. But if we can use it as a moment to make ambition, to create that race to the top, and to show leadership in the UK and across the world, then it'll certainly help us in our challenge and in that vision and hope for a new society and a new world order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. Indeed, I hope we have a race to the top, like you say. So I realise that we are running slightly behind time, but we are eating into your lunch break. There's not another session to go to. So I'm going to continue this and make sure that we give Farhana absolutely enough time, and also we'll have enough time as well to do the questions and answers. I see people have already been starting to put the questions in the question box, so that's great. Just to warn you, you will be on screen. We're going to try and, you know, log you into the screen to ask your questions. So I hope that you're not sat in your pajamas if you have asked a question, because we're going to try and turn your video on, is what I mean. Anyway, just before that, so please, Farhana, the floor is yours. You've been listening to everybody else, to the speakers, but please, you know, we'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfectly.
Yeah, apologies. My Wi-Fi here failed completely, so I lost a little bit of what Tom had been saying and a little bit of what Katie had been saying. But thank you for having me. I feel, having heard so many of the you can hear my dog as well barking. Sorry about that. I don't have time to take her out of the room, unfortunately. So I've written a short blog which came out this week and was posted in Business Green, called "Honouring the Paris Agreement: A Way Forward," and it's also posted on the Climate Vulnerable Forum website, just the CVF. You can find it there, and I guess I'll draw on that in my comments, which are at the end, and really reflect my capacity as someone who's represented the vulnerable countries for nearly 30 years in the climate negotiations, as to where we are now and what should we do going forward, and to make sure I don't forget to say the most important things. The messages that I want to send right now is that Paris is failing profoundly, and our sort of optimist bias and our desire to protect us from this harsh truth and talk about the things that are going well mustn't get in the way of now looking at, with honesty, with integrity, and with the solidarity of what's happening in the rest of the world as a result of essentially 30 years of delay, and on both the mitigation part, you know, preventing the emissions going into the atmosphere in the first place, and the adaptation side, getting ready for the impact. So we have massive gaps, and for the last 10 years, I professionally met Ed in 2009 at the Copenhagen conference, which was, called COP15, which was the mega COP, and had, more also nearly 30,000 people, and was supposed to provide the successor agreement to the Paris Agreement. And at that COP was the COP that developing countries, led by the small islands, led by the least developed countries, put forward the 1.5 degree target. So this is 11 years ago, 2009. And the die in the ditch issues for the countries I was representing was the inclusion of the 1.5 goal. They did not and would not have accepted, and Ed was there, we were all in the room together, we would not have accepted any document that referenced only 2 degrees. So this battle to get the world to listen to science was, you know, in the making 11 years ago. And 11 years ago, the reason why the vulnerable countries, 100 vulnerable countries that, you know, together emit less than 3% of the world's emissions and are now bearing the absolute full impact of the consequences of delay. So this is, I'm not sure that climate chaos is the defining issue of our age. And I think our failure of democracy to deal with issues that are long-term, complex, involve huge inequalities and are based on science is what is the real crisis. And you're seeing that in COVID. You know, democracy literally has been manipulated and used to ignore science. We still have anti-vaxxers. We still have people disputing the need for masks in this country too, you know, frankly, in all countries. So, you know, climate and COVID have many parallels in terms of the way in which we've been unable to really take forward the real social and equality agenda, the real injustice agenda. So my 3 sort of conclusions and what we should be focusing on, and especially what I hope Labour will focus on, you know, the progressive left will focus on, the Greens will focus on, are 3 things. One is that 2030 is the new 2050. I had a huge role to play in Paris and on reflection, you know, getting that net zero target into the Paris Agreement, getting also the net zero target by 2050 legislated in the UK, for example. I'm very proud of all of those things. But let's face it, that is way too late, and judging ourselves simply on the number of countries submitting long-term 2050 strategies, or in the case of the UK, putting forward this long-term sort of aspect and then not meeting any of the short-term 5-year budgets in the interim is really not okay. And 2030 will be what COP26 will be judged against. 2030 and the targets that were relevant for the next decade, broken down into 2 5-year budgets, was what the upgrade in ambition, these NDCs, was all about. And those NDCs were, and you know, we passed the deadline for submitting them on the 31st of December 2020, and essentially, yes, the EU submitted its you know, enhanced announced its enhanced agreement, the UK likewise, but the vast majority of the world failed to submit NDCs and has failed to signal that those will be enhanced. So the good news is, thankfully, we have some optimism in the sense that the Biden-Harris administration are going to put climate change at the top of their agenda and will be coming back into Paris. But we are nowhere near even the 2-degree target. Yes, we've come away from the 4 degrees, but let's not kid ourselves. We are not nearer the well below 2 degrees. We're not near the 1.5 degrees. And the consequences of that are absolutely devastating. So I'm going to give you just 2 statistics. In December 2020, Fiji, Cyclone Yasa, the second of the Category 5 hurricanes, you know, so the number of Category 5 hurricanes is going up in accordance with the predicted science, led to 1.4 billion losses in US dollars in Fiji, one country, one cyclone, destruction of hundreds of buildings, health, schools, homes, infrastructure damage. Likewise, Cyclone Amphan, which has affected Bangladesh and India, the West Bengal region, around 13 billion estimated losses, going higher actually, those were the initial estimates, 130 or 40 million in Bangladesh, you know, 500,000 people evacuated in the middle of COVID, by the way, you know, 80,000 people made homeless as a result of, you know, villages, 800 villages being flooded and made uninhabitable. This is the reality of what is happening right now in developing countries that are really vulnerable. And this is the consequences of delay. So they are coming to this COP expecting some honoring of the 3 goals of Paris. And the 3 goals of Paris are essentially the temperature goal translated into net zero emissions by 2050, with increases in short-term ambition. Goal number 1. Goal number 2 was to green all finances in line with climate resilience and zero carbon investment. We're a very long way from that. Yes, lots of progress. I'm not going to go into that, spelling out all of the progress, but we are so far away from the greening of finance as a whole that massive efforts need to be made. And the third goal was the goal of adaptation. That is actually a goal. The Paris Agreement, here it is. It actually says we have hereby established a goal of adaptation, which was to increase resilience, increase food security, increase disaster and risk reduction, and we have made no progress on that. The finance agreement, which was agreed in 2009, by the Copenhagen Agreement, formalized and then included in all of the agreements after that, in the 10 years after that. Sorry if I sound weary, but I am. And that is the tone message, the anger, the hurt, the complete lack of trust now in what especially richer countries, including the UK, are saying is phenomenal. And so that adaptation goal was to balance the finance, funding, resources, capacity, so that it would balance with mitigation. So mitigation is still getting the lion's share of the funding. It is, adaptation isn't. And on top of that, Paris finally included as the biggest priority of developing countries, again, something that I was very closely involved in, was loss and damage. Loss and damage is included as a separate article in the Paris Agreement. It was the die in the ditch issue in 2015 for most vulnerable countries, who said, we no longer want to come to these conferences and not have our lived reality recognized. Loss and damage is happening all over the world, not just in loss of human life, but loss of opportunities, education, schools that are devastated. The Dominican Republic, 90% of the buildings, including schools, were devastated in the again, hurricanes that took place in 2019. It's a lot of, we're now learning from COVID, what it means to lose a term or 2 terms of education. Well, these countries are facing these problems repeatedly, and they're being compounded. So I think restoration and reparations is going to be a dominant theme of the coming COP, and avoiding the idea that somehow we're going to get away with, recycling and pushing a few million here and there into countries is kind of a fantasy, frankly. The scale of, as I said, the lived reality is very different. And my final comment is, this theme, which again, I hope Labour, the Fabians, all of us, including myself in Camden, are exploring, is community is the new COP. It's over. We don't need 30,000 people turning up to any more of these COPs. First of all, that's not going to happen anyway. And secondly, it was a complete waste of time, because not enough then happened at the ground level, not enough happened domestically. And I would urge Labour, including the leadership, I was quite disappointed Keir only met the top, NGOs, when the big running, the big mobilizations, the real reason why we have a net zero target in UK legislation in the first place is actually the Green New Deal, led by so many able young people. It's the youth strike movement. It's the Extinction Rebellion, which I took part in too. So it's a real pity, actually, that grassroots energy, that new energy, those Black Lives Matter advocates who are saying now that climate justice, social justice, economic justice are one in the same linked agenda. Those voices are not being heard, and I hope that those voices will infuse and invigorate our democracy and demand action going forward. I think that those are the 3 main points that I think that the COP, the climate community, the social justice community need to take on forth. That it's really 2050 isn't it anymore. If you're going to go around giving us progress sheets along that metric, forget it. That's not going to solve the problem. And we need to start looking earnestly at reshaping democracy from the ground up, and listening to, as well as prioritizing, the voice of the marginalized, the voice of the vulnerable, the voice of Black and BAME communities, including globally, because it is the global South that is bearing the impacts of climate injustice right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farhana, for really, outlining all those really important issues. So I'm going to allow about 20 more minutes for this discussion. and I've been trying to go through the questions, so please allow me. We're going to ask, I think there's a host in the background who's going to put on the camera, I understand. So I'm going to take questions. I'm going to take 5 questions. So I hope that that's kind of one for each speaker, and we'll go through them. Then if you can ask your question in this order. So Monica Threlful, that was a question to Ed on youth. There was a question from Tim Root about the framing of COP and the Labour vision. A question from Ahmad Dut on climate risk. So, and then Dora Meredith and Sandy Martin. So if the host, if you could turn on the camera for Monica Threlful so she can ask a question, please. Don't know if this is possible. See if it works. We'll wait a moment. And then if the others that I mentioned, if you could be ready as well. I don't know if it's not possible for Monica, then we go to Tim Root. I have to say this is the first time I'm experiencing this, so I don't know. Okay, well, I'll just read out the questions then, because and you can see them as well, the speakers. So we'll take the first question. Monica Threlful, where were you now? Monica. Sorry, I thought that was Monica coming on, but it's my feedback. Tim Root, first of all, because I can see you. So Tim Root had a question. As people have heard several times in previous years, that the forthcoming COP was of historic importance, and many may therefore pay little attention now. Does Labour need to reframe the opportunity of COP, e.g. with a slogan like climate jobs for a healthy future? I'll just run through the questions. Monica Threlfeld to Ed Miliband, you mentioned the green agenda has to be and look fair. Young people are key to this, surely. So how would we involve young people to show the public that Labour is the party to vote for, perhaps together with the Greens? Question mark. Sandy Martin said, this is a question for you. You said at the end of the virus, we'll see the phasing out of massive state intervention on a European level. So, but however, the climate crisis is partly caused by individual spending decisions taking priority over democratically decided decisions. Don't you think we need to continue interventionist approaches for spending on climate-related investment? I won't read the others. Well, I hope you can see the others. So the other question was, for example, Dora Meredith on to what extent do you see the climate as a vote winner in the UK in the perspective of the 2024 elections? So I hope that I've kind of read those out. And please feel free then for the panelists to go through perhaps one of the others you've seen that have interested you. We're just going to have another 15 minutes or so discussion. So I'll just mix up the order a bit. We'll have Katie first, please. Why not?
Thank you. Sorry, I was just having a quick flick through. There's so many great questions. Yeah, the idea of a COP slogan, loved it. Thought it was great. So yes, good idea, good slogan. And I think being able to say, you know, how it would be, it's a moment. The COP is not the end point; it is a staging point. And Farhana was spot on. It's 2030 is the new 2050, and it's 1.5. It's not 2 degrees. So it's how and look. And it's not like we'll get to there and that's the top of the hill and we'll make up, but it's a staging point and it's a COP year. So the actions running up from the UK, from the EU, from the US, these are crucially important to, as Farhana talked about, building that trust and having that, you know, we're going to have to reinvest in these relationships. And we talk about that constructive pulling together of different parts of society. And everyone's going to have to, you know, re-emphasize that, including bringing back young people into the agenda. I think just trying to, do we want an interventionist approach? For sure. You know, in terms of this is a new, this is a crisis we've never faced. It's not an environmental, it's a social, it's an economic, it's a transition. And actually I'd urge people to look at the work of the Climate Assembly, which I thought was fascinating. that we did this climate assembly in the UK and took people on a journey where you don't normally get an opportunity to take people on that journey. But by the end of the journey, in terms of explaining the facts, explaining the political choices at play, actually the proposals were pretty radical and things that most politicians have shied away from in the past, in terms of frequent flyer tax, gas boilers, but they were pushing the boundaries. So I think that actually taking people on a journey and thinking about that longer term transition, that sort of this is going to be a 10-year at least societal transition that we're on, is that long term journey. But we need to as Farhana says, 2030, 2050. Just one last thing I saw on the US-China relations with Joe Powell on the questions. I mean, that is going to be key, and I think, in some ways the awful US-China relations actually played out fairly well last year in terms of China coming forward. We saw with a more ambitious commitment. Again, the devil's going to be in the detail of actually how they do that and when the peak year is going to be. So, but in terms of, and then obviously now with the US administration coming forward, that's great. But I think the US-China relationship will be key. And China is also hosting this poorer relation to the COP, which is called the CBD, which is on biodiversity, which is not as big, but is important because China is hosting it as much as anything. And we need to make sure that those two crises, which have always been kind of bizarrely taken apart, are put together, and we look at how we can solve those two things together at the same time. I can't hear you very well, Charlotte. I don't know about anybody else.
No.
So you might need to point who's next, or shall I appoint who's next? Tom, I think you're saying Tom.
A good finger jab is always the way forward. So I'm just running very quickly through the answers to those questions. Completely agree, love a slogan. But I would say one thing. I used to work at Oxfam heading their UK campaigns, and the story that's frequently told is that Make Poverty History 2005, really important to mobilise the British public around Britain's prominence in world affairs at that point. So much money and energy people aware of Make Poverty History and to understand its meaning and to support its aims. And then after the G8 and after all that attention faded away, when you looked at public awareness polls, there was a huge slip back. And I think what that says is that you need to have sustained energy, you need to have constant awareness of this issue. And it's not just about awareness, it's about calls to action. People need to feel empowered and actively engaged with these issues. And I think that's where youth can play a major role. By definition, they've got more of a kind of interest in some of these issues because they're going to be around in this way like we are. It's their future that's at stake. So disempowered. So what's the ways in which we set up fora and processes for youth to really share their voices, to express them? And I would say that the level of government which is nearest to communities, being local government, is where there ought to be that investment in youth fora. And I think government should recognise this, set the framework, give the funding to local councils, and get out of the way as quickly as possible. The other thing that I would say is around how you create zero carbon citizens. Let's be honest here, climate breakdown is huge. It's global, it's depressing, it's laden with very negative and heavy words. People just want to understand what we play in reducing their consumption. And one thing that we're toying around in Oxford with is looking at the data on our emissions, looking at what proportion of those come from individual carbon, and then trying to figure out what each Oxford citizen's individual carbon allowance would be on an annual basis, but segmenting and differentiating on the basis of people's income, assets and wealth and so on. And then just letting the public know that, giving them tips about how they can reduce their consumption. And then people feel like this is bite-sized, it's achievable, let's move forward. And I think the very last thing that I would say here is to what extent is climate a vote winner in this country? This may be provocative, I would say it's not. In my own ward, I would say it is because I'm representing Caroline Lucas's old council seat. But I think in the country, it's not presently. And I think that's because when you knock on a door and you say, we're addressing the climate emergency, people go, not another emergency. We've had austerity, we've now got austerity of steroids coming. Why are you asking us to make more? What we need to do is cohere that positive vision which comes up with an idea of what our welfare state would be that protects people, what our economy would be that trains up and gives job opportunities, and what our overall vision for the country would be that's confident and hopeful. Go out, sell that on the doorstep, and then people would be recognising climate because it would be embedded in, exactly as Farhana was saying, social justice, economic justice, and climate justice. It's all one and the same.
Thank you, Tom. And so we'll just quickly hear from Farhana, then Saeed and Ed to conclude, please.
Yeah, I've been trying to sort of keep up with the chat and the questions, and I mean, I want to make very clear that 1.5 is still achievable if we put in the massive effort needed to. Is my microphone off? Okay, so all the evidence, the best scientific economic evidence, and COVID has resulted in a -7% emissions. So we're both living in a world where I think there are these realities. The Paris Effect report produced by Systemic, where I'm an advisor, shows actually that if we act with haste, with urgency, in a joined up way, we can still make massive progress and switch to the kind of greener, nature protective, climate friendly, social justice friendly world possible. So no developing country, no one is saying stop trying to do 1.5 is impossible. They're saying the opposite. They're saying we've never put our serious effort into actually achieving it. And COVID, with the opportunity that is presented to us through the stimulus packages to redesign our economies, to intervene in them as we already have done, to cooperate globally, which is now a much more post-prospect, allows us to actually achieve it, and we can do it, but we have to move forward in that direction. And I think in that regard, the Biden-Harris administration is going to give a big boost, because the US economy will see a very different kind of stimulus, hopefully, than the ones that are currently happening, which are still too fossil fuel friendly, which are still weighted too much towards the old economy.
Thank you, Farhana. Thank you. And so please, Saeed, answer the questions, and then we'll have Ed.
Yeah, quickly. I mean, there was this question about whether government intervention need to be phased out. Obviously, it shouldn't. What would be phased out is, the support for temporary unemployment and to keep businesses alive. And this needs to be exchanged with other type of measures, and the recovery plans, the stimuli packages are part of this. And I think it's fair to say that the debate should be around whether these packages should be a one-off, or whether actually this transition deserves a more long-term commitment from governments to invest more. And so I think that debate needs to get started, because we should transform these recovery plans into transition plans, and it may take years, if not decades, actually, to transform the whole economy. Even though we need to invest, as much as possible in the next few years, because we all know that waiting will actually cost us more in the long term. The final point I want to make is, and I think Ed referred to it in his intervention, is that we need to redefine what is a successful economy. Talk differently about successful economies. It's not anymore GDP growth. That is the way how we can actually get towards this 1.5 degrees and develop an economy and a society that captures this wide variety of challenges much better. So you need much more indicators. And I think that's maybe something we need to think through and come up with some novel ideas, even though this is not a new debate. But I think that will be crucial. So yeah, I leave it here.
Great, thank you very much, Saeed. So Ed, you can wrap up in a few moments, please, all your thoughts and all the answers to all the questions. But you have the last word, so the floor's yours.
Well, I just want to thank my fantastic fellow panelists, and also the really good comments that have been made in the chat and the questions. I mean, I think, just to sort of summarize what I feel about this, I think it comes down to two things, which is ambition and vision. And I think the ambition question, which Farhana spoke so eloquently to, is, are we going to meet the scale of the emergency that we face? And, you know, I think that the COP is an important moment for the following reason, which is it must be, and this is what Farhana has worked on for so many years, it must be a forcing mechanism to force countries and heads of state and heads of government to face the scale of the challenge that there is, and not to pretend that we can negotiate with the science, because we can't negotiate with the science, and to say, are you going to rise to the scale of this challenge, the 1.5 degree challenge that we face? And that has got to be our you know, driving force this year, is to do everything we can to force countries to rise to the scale of that challenge. And then the second thing, I think, speaks to Monica's question and maybe some of the other points that people have made, is this vision question. I often say, and I hope this doesn't sound flippant, that Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a nightmare. He said, I have a dream. Now, the nightmare is a nightmare, and it isn't to trivialize or downgrade the importance of truth-telling about the scale of the nightmare. But I think that equally important is to motivate people with the vision of the that we can have, and to rise to this. But we've got all these other injustices in our country and our world, and we can do both. And that is the point. I think we can both confront the climate emergency and rise to the scale of what it presents, and meet these other injustices as we do it. And that has got to be what we do. And I think if we want to motivate young people, old people, middle-aged people, you know, people know there's big problems in our country and our world. You know, I think it's been so clear to people the scale of the injustices that we have. This is that you take. That the answer is not to say to people, this is all small change and it's not really going to change very much, and you know, we can do it quietly. Or do you tell people the truth, which is we need big change, and we need big change for our country, not just on climate but more generally, and we're going to rise to that. And the last point is, I completely agree with what others have said on this, is involving people in these decisions will make for bolder decisions, not more cautious decisions. That is all the evidence from the Climate Assembly here, the Climate Assembly in Ireland, the desire people have. If you talk honestly to people about the truth about the challenge we confront and what can be done, we can succeed. And in the end, you know, somebody asked in the chat about some of the technical challenges and the government relying on. This isn't really a technical challenge. This is actually a challenge of political imagination and political will. I think that is in the end what this is about. And I am actually optimistic. I'm not just saying this, but I'm actually optimistic that compared to where we were 10 years ago, when Farhana and I were at Copenhagen, the science is much more deadly, and the scale of the urgency that so many people confront is much more deadly, as Farhana has said. But I think there is you know, we do have it in our hands to tackle this problem, and to do so in a way that creates a fairer and more equitable world.
Great. Thank you very much, Ed. Very honest words, wise words, and I think we'll definitely heed those. So I think that concludes the end of this breakout session of the Fabian New Year's Conference on Climate Emergency. Thank you so much to all of you for attending and for your questions and for your participation. And thank you very much to the speakers. And I'm sorry if we ate into your lunchtime slightly. I think the plenary session is starting again at 15:15, so you've still got some time to eat, don't worry. And yeah, please, a little bit of applause for the speakers. And once again, thank you very much for this really, really, really interesting discussion.